Introduction, a symbol of dehumanization and resistance. Imagine a world where a young woman's body becomes a spectacle, her humanity stripped away under the guise of curiosity, science, and entertainment. In the gaslit halls of 19th-century Europe, crowds gathered not to marvel at art or innovation, but to gawk at a human being displayed like an animal in a cage. This was the world of Sarah Baartman, a Khoikhoi woman from South Africa, whose life and suffering exposed the grotesque intersection of colonialism, racism, and sexism. Her story is not merely a historical footnote, but a searing indictment of a society that commodified her body, erased her identity, and justified its cruelty with pseudoscience and profit. Sarah Baartman's tragedy challenges us to confront the darkest impulses of human history, those that reduce a person to an object, a curiosity, a thing to be prodded and studied. Yet her legacy also ignites a spark of resistance, a call to reclaim dignity and demand justice in a world that still grapples with the echoes of her exploitation. This introduction delves into the context of her life, the forces that shaped her fate, and the enduring relevance of her story as a lens through which we view the past and present. The fever of colonial ambition. In the early 1800s, Europe was a continent ablaze with ambition, its empires stretching across the globe like a spider's web, ensnaring lands, resources, and people. The Age of Enlightenment, celebrated for its pursuit of reason, had a shadow side, an obsession with categorizing and controlling the world. This era birthed colonial enterprises that plundered Africa, Asia, and the Americas, driven by a belief in European superiority. South Africa, under Dutch and later British control, was a battleground where indigenous communities like the Khoikhoi faced dispossession, violence, and cultural erasure. The Khoikhoi, a pastoral people with a rich history, saw their lands seized, their cattle stolen, and their way of life dismantled by settlers who viewed them as obstacles to progress. This was the crucible in which Sarah Baartman was born, a world where her very existence was deemed inferior by those who claimed dominion over her homeland. Colonialism was not just a physical conquest, it was a mindset that dehumanized entire populations. Europeans constructed a narrative of Africa as a dark continent, a place of savagery and mystery that justified exploitation. This narrative was not born in ignorance but in deliberate design, crafted to uphold the economic machinery of slavery and resource extraction. The Khoikhoi, with their distinct physical features and nomadic lifestyle, became particular targets of fascination and derision. Their bodies, their customs, their very humanity were dissected by European observers eager to prove their own supremacy. Sarah Baartman, born around 1789 in the Gamtoos Valley, entered this world at a time when her people were being pushed to the margins, their survival hanging by a thread. The rise of scientific racism. The 19th century was a paradox, a time of scientific advancement and intellectual curiosity, yet also an era of profound moral failure. The Enlightenment's quest for knowledge gave rise to scientific racism, a pseudoscience that sought to classify humans into hierarchies based on physical traits. Scholars like Georges Cuvier, a prominent French naturalist, developed theories that placed white Europeans at the pinnacle of civilization, while Africans were relegated to the bottom, closer to animals than humans. These ideas were not fringe but mainstream, taught in universities, published in journals, and embraced by the educated elite. The concept of the great chain of being, a hierarchical view of life, was twisted to justify slavery and colonial oppression, portraying Africans as a missing link between apes and Europeans. This pseudoscientific framework was not abstract, it had real-world consequences. It fueled the creation of human zoos, where indigenous people were kidnapped from their homes and displayed in European cities as living proof of racial theories. These exhibitions were marketed as educational, a chance for the public to witness the primitive and affirm their own place in the civilized world. Museums, universities, and scientific societies lent their prestige to these spectacles, blurring the line between scholarship and showmanship. For a few shillings, ordinary citizens could gape at human beings, their curiosity sanctioned by the veneer of science. This toxic blend of intellectual arrogance and public entertainment set the stage for Sarah Baartman's Exploitation, turning her body into a canvas for Europe's fears, desires, and prejudices. The allure of the exotic. The 19th century was also a time of spectacle, where the exotic was a commodity to be consumed. Circuses, freak shows, and ethnographic exhibitions flourished, catering to a public hungry for novelty. These events were not just entertainment. They were propaganda, reinforcing racial and cultural hierarchies. The term Hottentot, a derogatory label for the Khoikhoi, became synonymous with savagery in the European imagination. The physical features of Khoikhoi women, particularly steatopygia, a genetic trait causing pronounced buttocks, and elongated labia, were sensationalized as evidence of their supposed primitiveness. These traits, natural variations within their population, were distorted into symbols of otherness, fueling a voyeuristic fascination that bordered on obsession. This fascination was not innocent. It was rooted in a colonial mindset that saw African bodies as objects to be studied, displayed, and owned. The economic incentives were clear. Exhibitors and showmen amassed fortunes by parading indigenous people before paying audiences. The public, in turn, reveled in their sense of superiority, secure in the belief that they were witnessing the lower rungs of human evolution. For Sarah Baartman, this cultural climate meant that her body, her very existence, became a commodity before she ever set foot in Europe. Her story is a stark reminder of how profit and prejudice can conspire to strip away human dignity, leaving only exploitation in their wake. Sarah Baartman, a life stolen. Sarah Baartman, known as Sa in her native Khoikhoi language, was born into a world already fractured by colonial violence. Her early life was marked by loss. Her father was killed in a Dutch commando raid, part of the systematic campaign to seize Khoikhoi lands and cattle. Orphaned and vulnerable, she was forced into servitude, working for a Dutch farmer named Peter Caesars, near Cape Town. Her life was one of toil and subjugation, a microcosm of the broader oppression faced by her people. Yet, Sarah was more than a victim. She was a woman with dreams, fears, and a cultural heritage that her captors would never understand or acknowledge. In 1810, her life took a devastating turn. Hendrik Caesars, possibly a relative of her employer, and Alexander Dunlop, a British ship's doctor, approached her with a promise of wealth and opportunity in Europe. The details of their persuasion remain murky, shrouded in the power imbalances of the time. Did she go willingly, hoping for a better life? Or was she coerced, her agency stripped away by her circumstances? The answer is likely a painful mix of both, as a young Khoikhoi woman in colonial South Africa had little power to resist. What is clear is that Sarah was taken to London, far from her home, to be displayed as a curiosity, a decision that would seal her tragic fate. The stage of exploitation. In London, Sarah was thrust into a world of spectacle at 225 Piccadilly Street. Billed as the Hottentot Venus, a name dripping with irony and contempt, she was placed on a raised platform for crowds to ogle. Her exhibitors dressed her in tight flesh-colored clothing to accentuate her figure while maintaining a thin pretense of modesty. The audience, paying 2 shillings for the privilege, was encouraged to touch her, to prod her, to marvel at her body as if she were an exhibit in a zoo. The performances were choreographed to degrade. She was made to walk, turn, and sometimes dance, all while her handlers fed the crowd narratives of her savagery. This was not just exploitation. It was a deliberate erasure of her humanity, a spectacle designed to affirm European superiority. The horror of these exhibitions was compounded by their cultural impact. Sarah's body became a symbol of the exotic other, her features exaggerated and sexualized to fit European fantasies and fears. Her performances were not about her as a person, but about what she represented in the colonial imagination, a living justification for conquest and domination. Yet, even in this dehumanizing environment, there are hints of Sarah's resistance moments, when she refused to perform or asserted her presence in small, defiant ways. These fragments, though sparse, remind us that she was never just a victim, but a woman fighting to retain her dignity in impossible circumstances. A call to reflect and act. Sarah Baartman's story is a wound that refuses to heal, a reminder of how easily humanity can be discarded when greed and prejudice align. Her life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we participate in systems that dehumanize others, even today? What does it mean to restore dignity to someone whose very existence was turned into a commodity? Her exploitation was not an aberration, but a product of a society that normalized cruelty under the guise of progress. From the lecture halls of Paris to the sideshows of London, Sarah's body was used to uphold a worldview that justified centuries of oppression. Yet, her story is also one of resilience and reclamation. The fight to bring her remains home in 2002, after nearly 2 centuries of indignity, was a triumph of collective action, led by South African activists and global allies. Her legacy lives on in every effort to challenge racism, sexism, and exploitation, from museum reforms to feminist movements. Sarah Baartman was someone's daughter, perhaps a sister or friend, a woman with hopes and joys stolen by a world that saw only her body. Her story demands that we do more than mourn. It calls us to act, to build a world where no one's humanity is reduced to a spectacle. As we explore Sarah's life, we carry the weight of history and the responsibility to remember her not as the Hottentot Venus, but as Sa, a Khoikhoi woman whose suffering and strength continue to shape our understanding of justice. Her grave in the Eastern Cape is a place of pilgrimage, a testament to the enduring power of her story. This introduction sets the stage for a deeper exploration of her journey, from the brutality of colonial exploitation to the triumph of her homecoming, and the lessons we must carry forward to honor her memory and prevent such tragedies from happening again. Second, historical context. A world of injustice and exploitation. Building on the vivid tableau of Sarah Baartman's tragic exploitation outlined in the introduction, this section delves into the historical forces that shaped her fate. The early 19th century was a crucible of colonial ambition, scientific racism, and a burgeoning entertainment industry that thrived on dehumanization. These forces converged to create a world where a Khoikhoi woman like Sarah, referred to as Sa in her native tongue, could be stripped of her dignity and transformed into a spectacle. The introduction painted a picture of Europe's feverish obsession with the exotic and its moral failures masked by intellectual pursuits. Here, we explore the intricate web of colonial oppression in South Africa, the rise of pseudo-scientific racism, and the economic machinery of spectacle that turned human beings into commodities. This context not only illuminates the systemic cruelty that ensnared Sarah, but also underscores the broader mechanisms of power that justified and profited from her suffering, connecting her personal tragedy to the global currents of exploitation. Colonial domination in South Africa. The story of Sarah Baartman cannot be understood without examining the brutal reality of colonialism in South Africa, a land scarred by European conquest. By the late 18th century, the Dutch had established a foothold in the Cape Colony, followed by the British in the early 1800s. The Khoi, a pastoral people with a deep connection to their land, faced relentless dispossession. Their grazing lands were seized for European farms, their cattle confiscated, and their communities decimated by diseases like smallpox, introduced by settlers. The introduction highlighted the destruction of Khoi culture. Here, we see how this was a deliberate strategy to dismantle their economic and social structures. By the time Sarah was born around 1789, her people were reduced to a state of servitude, working as laborers on Dutch farms or scraping by in the margins of a colonial society that viewed them as inferior. This colonial project was not merely about land, but about power. The Khoi were subjected to a system of racial hierarchy that stripped them of agency. Dutch and British settlers justified their actions with a belief in their own cultural and racial superiority, a mindset that permeated every aspect of life in the Cape. Families like Sarah's were torn apart by violence. Her father, as noted in the introduction, was killed in a Dutch commando raid, a common tactic to suppress resistance and seize resources. Women, in particular, faced compounded vulnerabilities, often forced into domestic service or worse, their bodies subject to the whims of colonial masters. This environment of subjugation set the stage for Sarah's later exploitation, as her status as a Khoi woman made her an easy target for those seeking to profit from her perceived otherness. The economic dimension of colonialism was equally devastating. The Cape Colony became a hub for trade, with agriculture and shipping fueling European wealth. Indigenous labor was exploited to sustain this economy, and the Khoi were often paid in alcohol or meager rations, trapping them in cycles of dependency. This economic exploitation created a power imbalance that made it possible for individuals like Hendrik Caesars and Alexander Dunlop, mentioned in the introduction, to lure Sarah to Europe with false promises. The colonial system had already eroded her community's ability to protect its own, leaving her vulnerable to the manipulations that would lead to her tragic journey. The machinery of scientific racism. The introduction touched on the rise of scientific racism as a tool to justify colonial oppression, and this section expands on how this pseudoscience became a cornerstone of Sarah's exploitation. In the early 19th century, European intellectuals were obsessed with classifying the natural world, including humans. This impulse, rooted in the Enlightenment's pursuit of knowledge, was perverted into a justification for racial hierarchies. Scientists like Georges Cuvier, who would later dissect Sarah's body, developed theories that ranked human races based on physical traits, with Europeans at the apex and Africans at the bottom. These theories were not neutral. They were designed to uphold slavery and colonialism, providing a veneer of intellectual legitimacy to exploitation. The concept of the Great Chain of Being, briefly mentioned in the introduction, was central to this worldview. It posited a linear hierarchy of life, from inanimate objects to animals, humans, and divine beings. Within this framework, Africans were placed closer to animals, their physical differences exaggerated to emphasize their supposed primitiveness. The Khoi, with traits like steatopygia, prominent buttocks, and elongated labia, were particularly targeted. These natural variations, common among some African populations, were pathologized as evidence of inferiority. Scientists published detailed studies, complete with illustrations, that reduced people like Sarah to anatomical curiosities, their humanity erased in the name of knowledge. This pseudoscience was not confined to academic circles. It permeated popular culture. Museums and universities sponsored expeditions to collect specimens from colonized lands, including human remains and living people. These efforts were often framed as advancing human understanding, but they served to reinforce colonial power. The introduction noted how Sarah's body became a canvas for European prejudices. Here, we see how this was part of a broader scientific enterprise that dehumanized entire populations. The measurements, sketches, and reports produced by figures like Cuvier were not just academic exercises. They were weapons used to justify slavery, segregation, and the theft of indigenous lands. The spectacle of exploitation. The introduction described the allure of the exotic in 19th-century Europe, where crowds paid to gawk at Sarah Baartman. This section explores how this fascination was part of a thriving entertainment industry that profited from human suffering. The early 1800s saw the rise of ethnographic exhibitions and freak shows, where indigenous people, people with disabilities, and others deemed unusual, were displayed for public amusement. These spectacles were wildly popular, drawing thousands to fairgrounds, theaters, and exhibition halls. They were marketed as educational, offering a glimpse into the primitive world. But their true purpose was to entertain and reinforce racial stereotypes. The economic incentives behind these shows were immense. Promoters like those who exploited Sarah Hendrik Caesars and Alexander Dunlop earned significant profits by charging admission. In London, as noted in the introduction, audiences paid 2 shillings to see the Hottentot Venus, a sum that added up quickly. This commodification of human beings was part of a broader capitalist system that thrived on exploitation, from slave labor to colonial resource extraction. The Khoikhoi, already marginalized in their homeland, were particularly vulnerable to this global trade in human curiosities. Their physical features, so different from European norms, were sensationalized to maximize profit, turning natural variations into spectacles of otherness. These exhibitions were not just about entertainment, they were propaganda. By presenting people like Sarah as savages, they reinforced the colonial narrative that justified European dominance. The introduction highlighted how Sarah was made to perform a caricature of Africanness. Here, we see how this was a deliberate strategy to affirm the audience's sense of superiority. Handlers provided commentary, often laced with pseudoscientific jargon, to explain why Sarah's body was abnormal. This blend of spectacle and science created a powerful illusion of legitimacy, making it easier for audiences to accept the dehumanization of the people on display. The cultural and psychological toll, the exploitation of Sarah Baartman and others like her, had profound cultural and psychological impacts, both on the individuals displayed and on the societies that consumed these spectacles. For the Khoikhoi, the public display of their bodies reinforced stereotypes that would persist for centuries. The term Hottentot, used to market Sarah, became a slur synonymous with backwardness, used to justify the continued oppression of indigenous South Africans. This cultural violence extended beyond Sarah, shaping perceptions of African women as hypersexual and primitive, stereotypes that lingered in art, literature, and later media. The psychological toll on Sarah herself, hinted at in the introduction, was immense. Forced to endure the gaze of thousands, to be touched and mocked, she lived in a state of constant humiliation. The introduction mentioned her turn to alcohol as an escape. Here, we recognize this as a response to trauma, a desperate attempt to cope with the loss of agency and dignity. The colonial system that uprooted her from her homeland and the entertainment industry that profited from her suffering left her with no refuge. Her story reflects a broader pattern. The the psychological destruction of colonized peoples, whose identities were erased to serve the needs of their oppressors. For European audiences, these exhibitions had a different but equally damaging effect. They normalized cruelty, teaching generations to see certain people as less than human. The introduction described the banality of evil in Sarah's story, and this section underscores how ordinary citizens, scientists, and aristocrats participated in her exploitation without question. This normalization of dehumanization desensitized societies to the suffering of others, a legacy that would fuel centuries of racial injustice, from slavery to apartheid. Connecting to Sarah's story, the historical context outlined here is not just a backdrop, but the foundation of Sarah Baartman's tragedy. The colonial oppression that devastated her people, the pseudoscience that justified her dehumanization, and the entertainment industry that profited from her suffering were all interconnected systems of power. As the introduction noted, Sarah was more than a victim. She was a woman with a rich cultural heritage, caught in a world that refused to see her humanity. This section sets the stage for understanding how these forces converged to exploit her, from her coerced journey to Europe to her public humiliation in London and Paris. It also foreshadows the resilience of her legacy, as her story would later inspire movements to reclaim dignity and challenge the systems that destroyed her. The world that Sarah Baartman inhabited was one of stark contrasts, a society that prided itself on progress while perpetuating barbarity, that celebrated knowledge while weaponizing it against the vulnerable. Her story, as introduced earlier, is a call to reflect on our own complicity in systems of oppression and our responsibility to act. By understanding the historical forces that shaped her fate, colonialism, scientific racism, and the commodification of human beings, we gain insight into the mechanisms that continue to drive injustice today. Sarah's life, though brief and tragic, remains a powerful testament to the need for vigilance, empathy, and action in the face of exploitation. Third, the painful journey of Sarah Baartman. Following the historical context of colonial oppression, scientific racism, and the commodification of human beings outlined in Section 2, this section traces the harrowing journey of Sarah Baartman, a Khoikhoi woman whose life was consumed by the very forces that defined her era. Section 2 illuminated the systemic cruelty of a world that justified exploitation through pseudoscience and profited from human spectacle. Here, we follow Sarah, known as Sa in her native tongue, from her early life in a colonized South Africa to her coerced voyage to Europe, where she was displayed as the Hottentot Venus in London and Paris. This narrative delves into the personal toll of her exploitation, the fleeting moments of resistance, and the societal failures that allowed her suffering to persist. Sarah's journey is not just a chronicle of individual tragedy, but a lens through which we see the devastating impact of the colonial and capitalist systems described earlier, connecting her personal ordeal to the broader mechanisms of dehumanization. Early life in a colonized world. Sarah Baartman was born around 1789 in the Gamtoos Valley of South Africa's Eastern Cape, a region already scarred by the colonial violence detailed in Section 2. The Khoikhoi, her people, were pastoralists with a deep connection to their land. But Dutch settlers had dismantled their way of life through land seizures, cattle theft, and disease. As Section 2 noted, the Khoikhoi were reduced to servitude, their economic and cultural systems eroded. Sarah's childhood was marked by this devastation. Her father, a cattle herder, was killed in a Dutch commando raid, a brutal tactic used to suppress indigenous resistance and seize resources. Orphaned and vulnerable, Sarah was forced into servitude, likely working as a domestic laborer for a Dutch farmer named Peter Caesars near Cape Town. This early life of subjugation set the stage for Sarah's later exploitation. As Section 2 described, colonial South Africa was a place of stark power imbalances, where Khoikhoi women faced compounded vulnerabilities. Sarah's existence was shaped by a system that viewed her as less than human, her labor exploited, and her body subject to the whims of her colonial masters. Yet she was not merely a victim. She was a woman rooted in a rich Khoikhoi culture, with traditions, language, and stories that her captors would never acknowledge. This cultural heritage, though suppressed, hints at the resilience that would surface in small but significant ways during her later ordeal. The deceptive lure to Europe. In 1810, at around the age of 21, Sarah's life took a catastrophic turn. As Section 2 highlighted, the economic machinery of colonialism created opportunities for exploitation, and Sarah became a target. Hendrik Caesars, possibly a relative of her employer, and Alexander Dunlop, a British ship's doctor, approached her with promises of wealth and opportunity in Europe. Section 2 noted the economic incentives behind human exhibitions. Here, we see how those incentives played out in Sarah's case. The exact nature of their persuasion remains unclear, clouded by the power dynamics of a colonized woman in a colonial world. Did she believe she could escape the drudgery of servitude? Was she coerced, her lack of agency masked by promises of a better life? The truth likely lies in a painful gray area, where consent was impossible under such oppressive circumstances. The journey to London was a betrayal of trust, a stark example of the colonial exploitation described in Section 2. Sarah was not traveling as a free woman, but as a commodity, her body already earmarked for display. The men who took her to Europe saw her not as Sa, a Khoikhoi woman with dreams and dignity, but as a means to profit from Europe's fascination with the exotic. This moment marks the transition from her life in South Africa, where she was marginalized but still connected to her community, to a world where she would be utterly isolated, her identity reduced to a caricature. The spectacle in London. Upon arriving in London in 1810, Sarah was thrust into the heart of the entertainment industry described in Section 2. At 225 Piccadilly Street, she was displayed as the Hottentot Venus, a name that, as Section 2 explained, was laden with racial contempt and colonial irony. The term Hottentot was a slur, and Venus mocked her by invoking a European ideal of beauty she was never meant to embody. The exhibitions were meticulously staged to maximize humiliation and profit. Sarah was placed on a raised platform, dressed in tight, flesh-colored clothing that accentuated her statopegia, and other physical features that Europeans found freakish. As Section 2 noted, these traits were natural variations among some Khoikhoi women, but here they were weaponized to fuel voyeuristic curiosity. The audiences, paying 2 shillings for entry, were encouraged to treat Sarah as an object. They pointed, laughed, and sometimes touched her, as if she were livestock at a market. The performances were degrading. Sarah was instructed to walk back and forth, turn to display her body from every angle, and occasionally perform dances or speak in her native language, not as cultural expression, but as proof of her savagery. This choreography, as Section 2 suggested, was designed to reinforce colonial stereotypes, presenting Sarah as a living embodiment of the primitive African. The handler's commentary, laced with pseudo-scientific jargon, echoed the scientific racism discussed earlier, framing her body as evidence of racial inferiority. Despite this dehumanization, there are glimpses of Sarah's agency. Contemporary accounts suggest moments when she refused to perform or stared defiantly at her audience. Small acts of resistance that hint at her inner strength. These moments, though fleeting, connect to the resilience noted in the introduction, reminding us that Sarah was more than a passive victim. She was a woman navigating an impossible situation, her humanity persisting, even as it was systematically erased. Controversy and legal failure. The exhibitions in London were not without controversy. As Section 2 described, the early 19th century saw growing abolitionist movements, and some recognized Sarah's treatment as a form of slavery. The African Association, a group advocating for the rights of Africans in Britain, brought a court case in 1810, arguing that Sarah was being held against her will and subjected to degrading treatment. This challenge reflects the tension between the moral posturing of European society and its complicity in exploitation, as outlined in Section 2. The court proceedings, however, were a farce. Sarah was coached to testify that she was a willing participant, earning money, and free to leave a cruel fiction, given her lack of legal standing or resources, as a colonized black woman in 1810 London. The court's acceptance of her testimony, as Section 2 implied, was a failure of justice, reflecting the systemic indifference to the suffering of marginalized people. The case resulted in minor changes to the exhibitions, such as slightly less revealing clothing, but the exploitation continued unabated. This legal failure underscores the broader societal complicity described earlier, where even those who questioned the morality of Sarah's treatment were powerless or unwilling to dismantle the systems that profited from it. The depths of degradation in Paris. In 1814, seeking more receptive audiences, Sarah's handlers took her to Paris, the capital of culture that proved even more merciless. As Section 2 noted, the entertainment industry thrived on spectacle, and Paris took this to new extremes. Sarah fell into the hands of Rio, a showman who exhibited animals and saw no distinction between them and her. She was displayed alongside bears and other creatures, her humanity reduced to a literal sideshow. The exhibitions in Paris were more degrading than in London. Sarah was often nearly naked, wearing only a small apron that barely covered her, a stark contrast to the thin veneer of modesty in London. The French public, from aristocrats to commoners, flocked to see the Hottentot Venus, their enthusiasm fueled by the colonial fascination with the exotic described in Section 2. Scientists, including Georges Cuvier, attended these shows, not as spectators, but as researchers. They measured her body, sketched her features, and wrote reports that framed her as a scientific specimen, reinforcing the pseudoscience of racial hierarchies. These examinations were not just humiliating but invasive, treating Sarah as an object rather than a person. The psychological toll was immense. Contemporary accounts describe her growing withdrawn, her performances mechanical, her spirit dimming under the weight of relentless objectification. Sarah's health deteriorated rapidly in Paris. The poor living conditions, constant scrutiny, and lack of agency drove her to alcohol, a coping mechanism mentioned in the introduction and Section 2. By late 1815, at approximately 26 years old, she succumbed to what was officially recorded as an inflammatory and eruptive disease, possibly pneumonia or tuberculosis. The true cause, however, was the cumulative trauma of her exploitation, a life stripped of dignity, connection, and hope. Her death marked the end of her physical suffering but not the violation of her humanity, as her body would face further indignities, as explored in later sections. Linking to the broader narrative, Sarah Baartman's journey is a direct consequence of the colonial, scientific, and economic forces outlined in Section 2. The dispossession of her people in South Africa made her vulnerable to exploitation, while the pseudoscience of racial hierarchies justified her dehumanization. The entertainment industry, driven by profit, turned her body into a commodity, and the societal indifference evident in the failed court case allowed her suffering to continue. Yet, Her story also echoes the resilience hinted at in the introduction, with moments of defiance that foreshadow the later fight to reclaim her dignity. This section connects Sarah's personal tragedy to the systemic injustices described earlier, showing how her life was shaped by the same forces that oppressed countless others. Her journey from South Africa to London and Paris is a microcosm of the colonial project, a story of theft, exploitation, and erasure. As we move forward to explore the posthumous violation of her body and the fight for her repatriation, Sarah's story remains a powerful reminder of the human cost of unchecked power and the enduring need to resist dehumanization in all its forms. The Exploitation After Death section, the through, chronicled the harrowing journey of Sarah Baartman, from her early life in a colonized South Africa to her coerced exhibitions as the Hottentot Venus in London and Paris, culminating in her tragic death in 1815 at the age of approximately 26. The systemic forces of colonialism, scientific racism, and the commodification of human beings, detailed in Section 2, stripped her of dignity during her lifetime. Yet the violation of Sarah known as Sa among her Khoikhoi people did not end with her death. This section explores the posthumous exploitation of her body, as European scientists, led by Georges Cuvier, transformed her remains into a scientific specimen, perpetuating the dehumanization she endured in life. Her skeleton, brain, and genitals were preserved and displayed for over a century, becoming tools to reinforce racist ideologies and colonial power. This narrative connects the personal tragedy of Sarah's desecration to the broader cultural and intellectual currents of the 19th and 20th centuries, revealing how her body was weaponized to uphold oppressive systems and the lasting impact of this violation on perceptions of African women. The immediate aftermath. A body claimed by science. Sarah Baartman's death on December 29, 1815, marked not the end of her suffering, but a new chapter of indignity. As Section 3 noted, her health had deteriorated under the relentless strain of exploitation, poor living conditions, and psychological trauma in Paris. The official cause of death was listed as an inflammatory and eruptive disease, possibly pneumonia or tuberculosis. But the true cause was the cruelty of a system that treated her as less than human. Within hours of her passing, her body was claimed by Georges Cuvier, the prominent French naturalist introduced in Sections 2 and the 3rd, whose role in scientific racism was pivotal. Cuvier, a founder of comparative anatomy, saw Sarah not as a person, but as a specimen to validate his theories about racial hierarchies. Cuvier's autopsy of Sarah was meticulous and invasive, focusing on the physical traits that had been sensationalized during her life. Her steatopygia, prominent buttocks, and elongated labia, natural variations among some Khoikhoi women. As Section 2 explained, these features were pathologized by European scientists to prove African inferiority. Cuvier removed her brain and genitals, preserving them in jars of formaldehyde, and made a plaster cast of her entire body. Her skeleton was meticulously prepared for display, stripped of flesh and identity. This act of dissection was not merely scientific. It was a continuation of the voyeuristic fascination described in Section 3, now cloaked in the authority of academia. Cuvier's actions transformed Sarah from a living spectacle into a permanent exhibit, her humanity erased in death as it had been in life. The scientific narrative. A weapon of racism. Cuvier's subsequent report to the French Academy of Sciences, published in 1817, is a chilling document that epitomizes the pseudoscience discussed in Section 2. He describes Sarah's anatomy in obsessive detail, comparing her features to those of apes and suggesting she represented a missing link between animals and humans. His focus on her genitalia, described with prurient precision, revealed more about European sexual obsessions than any scientific truth. This report, as Section 2 noted, was part of a broader effort to classify humans into hierarchies, with white Europeans at the apex. Cuvier's conclusions provided intellectual cover for slavery, colonialism, and later apartheid, framing Africans as biologically inferior and justifying their exploitation. The scientific community embraced Cuvier's findings, and Sarah's remains became a cornerstone of racist anthropology. Her skeleton was mounted and displayed at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, alongside her preserved organs, as Section 3 foreshadowed. These exhibits were not hidden in academic vaults, but placed on public view, accompanied by plaques labeling her as a Hottentot specimen. For over 150 years, from 1815 to 1974, museum visitors gawked at her bones and organs, reinforcing the stereotypes that had fueled her exploitation in life. This public display, as Section 2 suggested, was propaganda disguised as education, normalizing the idea that African bodies were objects of study rather than bearers of humanity. The impact of this scientific narrative extended far beyond Sarah. As Section 2 highlighted, the pseudoscience of racial hierarchies influenced colonial policies and cultural perceptions. Cuvier's work on Sarah's body was cited in academic texts, shaping generations of anthropologists who perpetuated these racist theories. Her remains became a reference point for studies that justified the subjugation of African peoples, from the slave trade to the land grabs in South Africa. This intellectual legacy underscores the complicity of academia in the dehumanization process, a theme introduced in Section 2, and exemplified here in the treatment of Sarah's body. Cultural consequences, shaping stereotypes. The posthumous exploitation of Sarah Baartman had profound cultural repercussions, particularly in shaping perceptions of African women. As Section 3 described, her exhibitions in London and Paris sexualized and exoticized her body, creating a template for how Black women were viewed in Western culture. After her death, this template was cemented through scientific displays and publications. The term Hottentot Venus, with its blend of racial slur and mocking allusion to beauty, became a shorthand for the hypersexualization of African women. This stereotype, as Section 2 noted, influenced everything from colonial art to early pornography, portraying Black women as objects of desire and derision. The preservation of Sarah's remains amplified this cultural violence. Her skeleton and organs, displayed in a prestigious museum, lent a veneer of legitimacy to these stereotypes. Visitors, from schoolchildren to scholars, absorbed the message that African bodies were fundamentally different, more primitive, and less human. This perception seeped into popular culture, shaping media, literature, and even fashion, where African features were either fetishized or mocked. The introduction in Section 1 highlighted the lasting damage of these stereotypes. Here, we see how Sarah's posthumous treatment entrenched them, creating a legacy that would persist into the 20th century and beyond. This cultural impact was not limited to Europe. In South Africa, the display of Sarah's remains reinforced the dehumanization of the Khoikhoi, justifying the systemic oppression that Section 2 described, including the precursors to apartheid. The idea that African bodies were objects for study and consumption became a cornerstone of colonial ideology, affecting policies that marginalized indigenous communities. Sarah's body, preserved in Paris, became a weapon against her own people, a symbol of their supposed inferiority wielded by those who profited from their subjugation. The psychological and ethical void. The treatment of Sarah's remains reveals a profound ethical failure, connecting to the moral bankruptcy of European society discussed in Sections 1 and 2. The scientists who studied her body The curators who displayed it, and the public who viewed it all, participated in a collective denial of her humanity. As Section 3 noted, Sarah's psychological trauma in life was evident in her withdrawal and reliance on alcohol. In death, this trauma was extended through the violation of her body, a final erasure of her identity as Sa, a Khoikhoi woman with a life, family, and culture. The ethical void is particularly stark in the scientific community's complicity. Cuvier and his colleagues operated under the guise of advancing knowledge, but their work was driven by prejudice and ambition. The preservation of Sarah's organs in jars, as if they were curiosities to be gawked at, mirrors the voyeuristic exhibitions of her lifetime. This lack of respect for her bodily autonomy reflects the broader disregard for indigenous peoples' rights, a theme introduced in Section 2. The fact that her remains were displayed until 1974, long after the scientific theories they supported were discredited, underscores the persistence of this ethical failure. The psychological impact extended beyond Sarah to her community and descendants. The Khoikhoi, already decimated by colonialism, were further insulted by the public display of one of their own as a specimen. This act of desecration, as Section 2 suggested, was part of a broader pattern of cultural violence that sought to erase indigenous identities. For those who learned of Sarah's fate, her story became a source of collective grief, a reminder of the indignities inflicted on their people by colonial powers, resistance, and the seeds of reclamation. Even in death, Sarah's story began to inspire resistance, a theme that connects to the resilience highlighted in Sections 1 and 3. As early as the 19th century, some voices, albeit few, questioned the morality of her treatment. Abolitionists in London, as noted in Section 3, had challenged her exhibitions, and their efforts foreshadowed later movements to reclaim her dignity. By the 20th century, as the anti-apartheid movement gained momentum in South Africa, Sarah's story was rediscovered by activists, scholars, and poets. They saw her not as a specimen, but as a symbol of colonial violence and indigenous strength, a narrative that would lead to the fight for her repatriation, explored in later sections. This nascent resistance connects to the broader struggle against the systems of oppression outlined in Section 2. The scientific and cultural narratives that justified Sarah's exploitation were not unchallenged. They were contested by those who recognized the humanity of the oppressed. These early efforts, though limited in their immediate impact, planted the seeds for the global movement to return Sarah's remains to South Africa in 2002, restoring her as Sa, a daughter of the Khoikhoi, rather than the Hottentot Venus. Linking to Sarah's legacy. The posthumous exploitation of Sarah Baartman's body is a direct extension of the forces that shaped her life, as detailed in Sections 2 and 3. The colonialism that uprooted her people, the pseudoscience that dehumanized her, and the entertainment industry that profited from her suffering all converged in the treatment of her remains. Cuvier's autopsy and the display of her skeleton were not isolated acts, but part of the same continuum of violence that began in the Cape Colony and continued in the exhibition halls of Europe. Yet, as Section 1 emphasized, Sarah's story is also one of reclamation, and this section sets the stage for understanding how her desecration fueled a movement to restore her dignity. The violation of Sarah's body after death reflects the banality of evil described in Section 1, where respected scientists and institutions normalized cruelty. Her preserved remains, displayed for generations, were a testament to the enduring power of racist ideologies. But they also became a rallying point for resistance, as activists would later demand her return, challenging the systems that had exploited her. This section bridges the personal tragedy of Sarah's life and death with the collective fight for justice, showing how her story continues to resonate as a call to confront the legacies of colonialism, racism, and sexism in our world today. The fight for repatriation and enduring legacy. Section 4 detailed the harrowing posthumous exploitation of Sarah Baartman, whose body was dissected, preserved, and displayed as a scientific specimen in Paris, perpetuating the dehumanization she suffered in life. The colonial greed, scientific racism, and cultural commodification outlined in sections 2 and 3 stripped her of her identity as Sa, a Khoikhoi woman, reducing her to a museum exhibit until 1974. This section explores the decades-long struggle to repatriate her remains to South Africa, culminating in her homecoming in 2002 and the profound legacy she left behind. The fight to restore her dignity transformed Sarah from a symbol of colonial violence into an icon of resistance, inspiring global movements for indigenous rights, reparative justice, and ethical reform in science and museums. Her story connects the personal tragedy of her exploitation to broader efforts to confront historical injustices, urging us to honor her memory by challenging systems of oppression today. The long shadow of exploitation. After Sarah Baartman's death in 1815, her remains skeleton, brain, and genitals were displayed at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, as described in Section 4. For over 150 years, her body was a public spectacle, labeled as a Hottentot specimen to reinforce racist stereotypes. This prolonged violation, sanctioned by the scientific establishment, was a stark extension of the colonial and pseudo-scientific forces outlined in Section 2. While Europe advanced through industrialization and social reforms, Sarah's remains remained a relic of its moral failures, untouched by the ethical awakening that should have ended such displays. The silence surrounding her story during this period mirrors the broader erasure of indigenous voices, a theme introduced in Section 2, where colonial powers systematically dismantled Khoikhoi culture. The rediscovery of Sarah's story in the late 20th century was a turning point. As global decolonization movements gained momentum, particularly in Africa, her case emerged as a symbol of the atrocities inflicted on indigenous peoples. In South Africa, the anti-apartheid struggle, which challenged the racial hierarchies rooted in the same ideologies that dehumanized Sarah, brought her narrative to the forefront. Activists, poets, and scholars began to reframe her not as a scientific curiosity, but as Sa, a woman whose suffering demanded justice. This shift, hinted at in Section 4's discussion of early resistance, marked the beginning of a movement to reclaim her humanity, challenging the institutions that had profited from her desecration. The campaign to bring Sarah home. The fight to repatriate Sarah Baartman's remains began in the 1980s, driven by a coalition of South African activists, intellectuals, and international supporters. As Section 2 noted, the colonial dispossession of the Khoikhoi left a legacy of loss, and Sarah's case became a focal point for addressing this historical wound. Activists argued that her continued display in Paris was not a neutral scientific act, but a perpetuation of colonial violence, echoing the dehumanization described in Sections 3 and 4. The campaign was about more than returning her remains. It was about dismantling the racist narratives that had justified her exploitation and restoring her as a human being with a name, culture, and community. The effort faced formidable obstacles. The French scientific community, as Section 4 suggested, defended the retention of Sarah's remains, claiming they were essential to anthropological research. This argument that her body was a universal scientific artifact mirrored the colonial mindset that treated indigenous people as objects, as discussed in Section 2. It revealed a persistent arrogance in Western institutions, which prioritized their own interests over the dignity of colonized peoples. South African activists, including Khoi descendants, countered that Sarah's remains were not property, but a stolen legacy, deserving of a dignified burial in her homeland. The campaign gained momentum in the 1990s, fueled by South Africa's transition to democracy after the fall of apartheid in 1994. Leaders like Nelson Mandela lent political weight to the cause, framing it as part of the nation's reckoning with its colonial past. International pressure grew, with protests, media campaigns, and diplomatic negotiations highlighting the moral urgency of Sarah's return. This effort connected to the broader resistance against colonial plunder described in Section 2, where indigenous communities worldwide began demanding the repatriation of their ancestors' remains from Western museums. The campaign was a testament to the resilience foreshadowed in Section 4, where early abolitionist challenges to Sarah's exploitation laid the groundwork for later activism. The Homecoming. A moment of restoration. On August 9, 2002, Sarah Baartman's remains were finally returned to South Africa, a historic victory nearly 2 centuries after her death. The South African government organized a state funeral in the Eastern Cape, near her birthplace in the Gamtoos Valley, deliberately held on Women's Day to honor her as a symbol of resilience against gendered and racial oppression. Thousands attended, including Khoi descendants, activists, and global dignitaries, to pay tribute to a woman whose suffering had come to represent the broader colonial trauma. The ceremony was a powerful act of restorative justice, addressing the cultural and psychological wounds described in Section 4. The funeral incorporated traditional Khoi rituals, reaffirming Sarah's identity as Sa, a daughter of her people, rather than the Hottentot Venus of colonial infamy. Speeches emphasized her humanity, acknowledging her as someone with dreams, fears, and a cultural heritage stolen by colonial greed. This moment of communal mourning and celebration connected to the resilience highlighted in Section 1, transforming Sarah's narrative from one of victimhood to one of dignity, reclaimed. Her burial site, a simple grave in the Eastern Cape, became a place of pilgrimage where visitors leave flowers, drawings, and gestures of care that contrast starkly with the cruelty she endured, as noted in Section 3. The repatriation had a global impact, setting a precedent for the return of indigenous remains held in Western institutions. As Section 2 described, the colonial era saw widespread plundering of human remains for scientific study, and Sarah's case inspired similar campaigns in Australia, the Americas, and beyond. Her homecoming challenged museums to confront their complicity in colonial violence, prompting reforms in how human remains are handled and displayed. This shift reflects the ethical reckoning foreshadowed in Section 4, where the scientific community's role in Sarah's exploitation was exposed as a moral failure. A legacy of resistance and reflection, Sarah Baartman's repatriation transformed her into an icon of resistance, a theme that builds on the seeds of defiance noted in Sections 3 and 4. Her story inspired a wave of cultural and political activism, particularly in South Africa, where she became a symbol of the fight against colonial and apartheid legacies. Artists, writers, and filmmakers reimagined her life, creating works that gave voice to her silenced humanity. These creative responses, unlike the scientific reports that dehumanized her in Section 4, focused on her inner world, imagining her thoughts, emotions, and acts of resistance. This artistic reclamation aligns with the call in Section 1 to see Sarah as Sa, a woman with agency and dignity. Her legacy also reshaped educational curricula. In South Africa and globally, Sarah's story is taught as a lesson in colonial history, human rights, and the intersection of racism and sexism. These lessons, as Section 2 suggested, challenge students to question the production of knowledge and its role in oppression. Pedagogical approaches emphasize empathy and critical thinking, ensuring that her story is not just a historical tragedy, but a call to address contemporary injustices, such as the objectification of women of color in media and the ongoing exploitation of marginalized communities. On a global scale, Sarah's case influenced movements for indigenous rights and repatriation. Museums worldwide, confronted by her story, began re-evaluating their collections of human remains, many acquired through colonial theft. New ethical frameworks, prioritizing consent and collaboration with descendant communities, emerged as a direct result of cases like Sarah's. Her legacy thus connects to the broader struggle against colonial plunder, as outlined in Section 2, and the ethical void exposed in Section 4. Her story became a touchstone for international human rights frameworks, recognizing the treatment of indigenous remains as a violation of dignity and advocating for their return. Contemporary relevance. A call to action. Sarah Baartman's legacy remains painfully relevant, linking her historical exploitation to modern challenges. The hypersexualization of Black women's bodies, rooted in the stereotypes perpetuated by her exhibitions, Section 3, and scientific displays, Section 4, persists in media, fashion, and entertainment, and her story informs African feminist movements, which highlight the intersection of race and gender in ongoing struggles against objectification and exploitation. Activists use her experience to advocate for bodily autonomy and cultural respect, addressing issues from human trafficking to the commodification of marginalized identities. In the digital age, Sarah's story faces new risks and opportunities. Social media can amplify awareness, but also risks sensationalizing her suffering through decontextualized images or narratives, echoing the voyeurism of her lifetime. Digital activists work to tell her story responsibly, ensuring it educates rather than exploits. This challenge connects to the cultural violence described in Section 4, where her body was used to shape harmful stereotypes, and underscores the need for ethical storytelling. Sarah's legacy also intersects with environmental justice. As Section 2 noted, the colonial dispossession of Khoikhoi lands was part of a broader extraction of resources. Today, climate change threatens the Eastern Cape, where Sarah was born and buried, linking her story to the fight for environmental justice and indigenous land rights. Her grave, a site of pilgrimage, reminds us that the colonial project of erasing indigenous connections to land continues in new forms, making her story a call to protect both human and environmental dignity. Linking to Sarah's story, the repatriation of Sarah Baartman's remains was a direct response to the posthumous violations detailed in Section 4, addressing the scientific and cultural exploitation that turned her body into a specimen. It connects to the systemic forces of colonialism and racism outlined in Section 2, which made her vulnerable, and the personal tragedy of her exhibitions in Section 3, which stripped her of agency. Her homecoming was a triumph of the resilience foreshadowed in Section 1, where her story was framed as both a tragedy and a call to action. The fight to bring her home challenged the institutions that profited from her suffering, transforming her into a symbol of resistance against dehumanization. Sarah Baartman's legacy is a beacon for justice, urging us to confront the legacies of colonialism, racism, and sexism in our world. Her story demands that we do more than remember. It calls us to act against exploitation, against silence, against the systems that reduce human beings to objects. By honoring Sa, not the Hottentot Venus, we reclaim her humanity and pledge to build a world where dignity is inviolable. Her grave in the Eastern Cape stands as a testament to this commitment, a place where the earth bears witness to her suffering and our responsibility to ensure it is never repeated. Vise. Contemporary relevance. Sarah Baartman, in the Modern World section The Five, chronicled the triumphant repatriation of Sarah Baartman's remains to South Africa in 2002, transforming her from a symbol of colonial exploitation into an icon of resistance and restorative justice. Building on the systemic injustices outlined in sections 2, 3, and IV, colonial dispossession, scientific racism, and posthumous desecration, and the resilience highlighted in sections 1 and V. This section explores how Sarah's story resonates in today's world. Her experience as Sa, a Khoikhoi woman reduced to the Hottentot Venus, illuminates ongoing issues of racial and gender-based exploitation, ethical failures in science and museums, and the fight for indigenous and environmental justice. In the digital age, her narrative faces new challenges and opportunities, from the risk of sensationalism to the potential for global advocacy. Sarah's legacy is a clarion call to confront modern forms of dehumanization, ensuring her story inspires action to protect dignity and equity across diverse contexts. Intersectionality, race, gender, and exploitation. Sarah Baartman's exploitation, as detailed in sections 3 and 4, was rooted in the intersection of racism and sexism, where her identity as a Black African woman was weaponized to justify her dehumanization. This intersectionality remains profoundly relevant today. The hypersexualization of Black women's bodies, a stereotype cemented by Sarah's exhibitions and scientific displays, persists in contemporary media, fashion, and entertainment. From music videos to advertising campaigns, Black women are often portrayed in ways that echo the voyeuristic fascination with Sarah's body, reducing them to objects of desire rather than complex individuals. This perpetuation of harmful imagery, as Section 4 noted, traces back to colonial stereotypes that framed African women as inherently sensual and other. African feminist movements, particularly in South Africa, draw directly on Sarah's story to challenge these stereotypes. Activists highlight how the intersection of race and gender continues to marginalize Black women, from workplace discrimination to systemic violence. For example, campaigns against gender-based violence in South Africa often reference Sarah to underscore the historical roots of bodily exploitation, connecting her experience to modern struggles for autonomy and respect. Her story informs advocacy for policies that protect women of color from objectification, such as stricter regulations on media portrayals and workplace equity laws. This fight aligns with the resilience described in Section 5, where Sarah's repatriation inspired movements to reclaim dignity, making her a touchstone for global feminist solidarity. Beyond gender and race, Sarah's story resonates with broader intersectional struggles. The colonial dispossession of the Khoikhoi, outlined in Section 2, parallels the marginalization of other oppressed groups, such as indigenous women worldwide, who face similar intersections of racial, gender, and economic exploitation. Her legacy encourages coalitions across these communities, fostering solidarity in movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, which address systemic inequities with roots in the same colonial ideologies that harmed Sarah. Her story reminds us that dismantling oppression requires addressing its interconnected forms, a lesson as urgent today as it was in her time. Ethical reforms in science and museums. The scientific racism that justified Sarah's exploitation, as explored in sections 2 and 4, has left a lasting stain on the scientific community. Her posthumous treatment dissected and displayed as a specimen exposed the ethical void in 19th-century anthropology, a theme that continues to shape modern debates about scientific integrity. Today, her case drives calls for ethical reforms in science, particularly in how human remains and cultural artifacts are studied and displayed. The repatriation of her remains, detailed in Section 5, set a precedent for returning indigenous ancestors held in Western institutions, prompting a global reckoning with the colonial legacy of museum collections. Museums worldwide have faced increasing pressure to repatriate human remains and cultural objects, a direct outcome of cases like Sarah's. For example, institutions in Europe and North America have begun returning Aboriginal remains to Australia and Native American artifacts to tribal nations, echoing the diplomatic and activist efforts that brought Sarah home. These reforms include new ethical guidelines, such as the International Council of Museums Code, which prioritizes collaboration with descendant communities and informed consent. Sarah's story has been instrumental in these changes, forcing curators to confront the colonial violence embedded in their collections, as Section 1 highlighted in the context of her museum display. In science, her case has spurred discussions about the ethics of research involving marginalized populations. Modern genetic and anthropological studies, for instance, now emphasize community engagement and equitable benefit sharing, a stark contrast to the exploitative practices of Georges Cuvier and his contemporaries. Sarah's legacy challenges researchers to question who benefits from their work and whether it perpetuates harm. Universities and research bodies have established ethics boards to prevent the kind of pseudoscientific racism that dehumanized her, ensuring that science serves humanity rather than oppression. This shift reflects the call in Section 1 to learn from Sarah's suffering, making her story a catalyst for accountability in knowledge production. Digital age challenges and opportunities. The digital age presents both risks and opportunities for Sarah Baartman's story, a theme that builds on the cultural impact discussed in Section 4. Social media platforms, with their global reach, can amplify awareness of her legacy, educating millions about colonial violence and resistance. Activists and educators use platforms like X to share her story, connecting it to contemporary issues like racial justice and gender equality. These efforts align with the advocacy described in Section 5, where her repatriation inspired global movements. Digital campaigns, such as hashtags and video essays, reframe Sarah as Sa, emphasizing her humanity and countering the colonial narratives that defined her as the Hottentot Venus. However, the digital landscape also poses risks. As Section 4 noted, Sarah's body was exploited through voyeuristic displays, and today, decontextualized images or sensationalized retellings on social media can replicate this harm. Clickbait articles or viral posts that focus on her physical features without historical context risk perpetuating the same objectification she endured. Ethical storytelling, therefore, is crucial. Digital activists advocate for responsible narratives that center her agency and the systemic forces behind her exploitation, as outlined in Sections 2 and 3. Online platforms like grok.com and educational websites provide spaces to share her story with depth and respect, ensuring it educates rather than exploits. The digital age also enables global solidarity. Sarah's story has been adopted by indigenous communities worldwide, from Native Americans to Aboriginal Australians, who use online networks to advocate for repatriation and cultural preservation. These connections amplify the transnational impact of her legacy, as noted in Section 5, making her a symbol of shared resistance against colonial legacies. The challenge is to maintain this momentum without reducing her story to a meme or a fleeting trend, a concern that echoes the call in Section 1 to honor her dignity through meaningful action. Environmental justice and indigenous land rights. Sarah Baartman's story is deeply tied to the land, a connection rooted in the colonial dispossession of the Khoikhoi described in Section 2. The destruction of their grazing lands and resources was a form of environmental violence that parallels modern challenges. Today, the Eastern Cape, where Sarah was born and buried, faces threats from climate change, including droughts and soil degradation, which disproportionately affect indigenous communities. Her legacy informs environmental justice movements that link colonial exploitation to ecological harm, advocating for the protection of indigenous lands and resources. The fight for environmental justice connects to Sarah's story through the concept of land as kin. For the Khoikhoi, land was not just a resource but a cultural and spiritual anchor, a bond severed by colonial settlers. Modern indigenous movements, inspired by cases like Sarah's, demand the restoration of land rights and sustainable practices that honor this connection. Her grave in the Eastern Cape, as mentioned in Section 5, is a site of pilgrimage that symbolizes this bond, reminding activists that environmental justice is inseparable from cultural and human rights. This perspective challenges the colonial extraction mindset that fueled Sarah's exploitation, as discussed in Section 2, and calls for a holistic approach to justice. Globally, Sarah's story resonates with indigenous groups fighting resource extraction on their lands, from mining in Australia to deforestation in the Amazon. These struggles echo the Khoikhoi's loss of land and livelihood, making her a symbol of resistance against environmental colonialism. Advocacy groups use her story to highlight how historical injustices shape modern disparities, pushing for policies that prioritize indigenous stewardship of land and resources. This connection underscores the contemporary relevance of her legacy, as introduced in Section 1, where her story was framed as a call to confront ongoing forms of exploitation. A call to action, building a just future. Sarah Baartman's story is not a relic of the past, but a living challenge to address modern injustices. The systems that exploited her colonialism, racism, and sexism persist in new forms, from systemic discrimination to the commodification of marginalized bodies. Her legacy demands action to challenge stereotypes in media, reform unethical practices in science and museums, and protect indigenous lands from environmental harm. As Section 5 emphasized, her repatriation was a step toward justice, but it was not the end. Her story urges us to confront complicity in modern systems of oppression, from supporting ethical media to advocating for policy changes that protect marginalized communities. In education, Sarah's story is a tool for fostering empathy and critical thinking. Schools and universities worldwide teach her narrative to explore the intersections of history, race, and gender, encouraging students to question narratives that dehumanize. This educational impact builds on the cultural legacy described in Section 5, where her story inspired art and activism. By teaching Sarah's story with nuance, educators ensure that her suffering is not sensationalized, but used to inspire change, a goal aligned with the ethical storytelling advocated in this section. Sarah's grave in the Eastern Cape remains a powerful symbol. Visitors leave tokens of respect, flowers, stones, letters echoing the communal mourning of her 2002 funeral. This act of remembrance connects to the call in Section 1 to honor Sa, not the Hottentot Venus. Her legacy challenges us to act with intention, to build a world where no one's humanity is reduced to a spectacle. By amplifying her story through ethical platforms, supporting indigenous and feminist movements, and advocating for environmental justice, we honor her memory and ensure that her suffering was not in vain. Linking to Sarah's narrative, Sarah Baartman's contemporary relevance ties directly to the injustices detailed in earlier sections. The racism and sexism that fueled her exploitation, Sections 3 and 4, persist in modern stereotypes, while the colonial dispossession of her people, Section 2, informs today's environmental justice struggles. Her repatriation, Section 5, was a triumph of resistance, but her legacy demands ongoing action to address the systems that harmed her. The ethical failures of science and museums, exposed in Section 4, are being challenged by reforms inspired by her case, while the digital age offers new ways to share her story responsibly. Sarah's narrative, as introduced in Section 1, is a call to reflect and act, urging us to dismantle the legacies of colonialism and build a future where dignity is universal. Her story as Say, a Khoikhoi woman, is a beacon for justice, illuminating the path toward a world free from exploitation. By confronting the intersections of race, gender, and environmental harm, and by advocating for ethical practices in science, culture, and media, we honor her resilience and ensure that her legacy inspires meaningful change. 7th, Art and Resistance. Reclaiming Sarah Baartman's narrative section explored the contemporary relevance of Sarah Baartman's story, highlighting how her experience as Sa, a Khoikhoi woman, informs modern struggles against racial and gender-based exploitation, ethical failures in science, and environmental injustice. Building on the systemic injustices outlined in sections 2 through IV colonial dispossession, scientific racism, and posthumous desecration, and the triumph of her repatriation in Section 5, this section delves into how artists, writers, and activists have reclaimed Sarah's narrative through creative expression. These efforts transform her from a victim of colonial violence, as depicted in Sections 3 and 4, into a symbol of resilience and resistance, echoing the call to action in Sections Y and 6. By reimagining her life through art, literature, and performance, contemporary creators restore her humanity, challenge the stereotypes that defined her, and inspire movements for justice. This section connects Sarah's story to the power of art as a tool for resistance, education, and healing, ensuring her legacy as Sa endures as a beacon for change in a world still grappling with the legacies of colonialism. The power of art in reclaiming humanity. The exploitation of Sarah Baartman, as detailed in Sections 3 and I-4, stripped her of her identity, reducing her to the Hottentot Venus through exhibitions and scientific displays. These acts erased her as Sa, a woman with a rich Khoikhoi heritage, replacing her humanity with a caricature rooted in colonial fantasies. Art, however, has the power to undo this erasure, and contemporary creators have seized this opportunity to restore her dignity. Unlike the pseudoscientific reports of Georges Cuvier, which dehumanized her as described in Section 4, artistic works imagine her inner life, her thoughts, emotions, and acts of defiance, offering a counter-narrative to the colonial gaze. South African artists, in particular, have led this reclamation. Poets like Diana Ferris, whose 1998 poem I've Come to Take You Home galvanized the repatriation movement described in Section 5, gave voice to Sarah's silenced spirit. Ferris's work envisions Sarah's longing for her homeland, portraying her as a daughter of the Gamtoos Valley rather than a specimen in a Parisian museum. This poem, written with raw emotion, sparked international awareness and became a rallying cry for activists, connecting directly to the restorative justice efforts that brought Sarah's remains home in 2002. Such artistic expressions counter the voyeuristic displays of her lifetime, as detailed in Section 3, by centering her humanity and cultural roots. Visual artists have also reimagined Sarah's story. South African painter Willie Bester's mixed media works, for instance, depict Sarah with bold colors and textures, emphasizing her strength and defiance rather than her victimhood. These pieces challenge the colonial imagery that objectified her, as discussed in Section 4, by portraying her as a figure of power and agency. Similarly, contemporary Khoikhoi artists incorporate traditional motifs into their work, linking Sarah to their ancestral heritage and rejecting the Hottentot label imposed by colonizers. These artistic efforts align with the call in Section 1 to honor Sa, ensuring her story is told with respect and depth. Literature as a tool for resistance literature has been a powerful medium for resisting the colonial narratives that defined Sarah Baartman. Novelists and playwrights have crafted stories that imagine her inner world, filling the gaps left by historical records. For example, the novel The Hottentot Venus by Barbara Chase Rabu explores Sarah's life through a fictional lens, portraying her as a complex individual navigating unimaginable hardship. Unlike the scientific reports that reduced her to anatomical details, as described in Section 4, such works humanize her, imagining her relationships, dreams, and moments of resistance, like those hinted at in Section 3 when she defied her exhibitors. Playwrights have also brought Sarah's story to the stage, using performance to challenge audiences directly. Susan Laurie Parks's play Venus, 1996, confronts the voyeurism of Sarah's exhibitions, forcing viewers to grapple with their complicity in consuming her story. By blending historical facts with poetic dialogue, Parks critiques the intersection of racism and sexism, a theme central to Section 6. These theatrical works create a visceral connection to Sarah's suffering, making her story accessible to diverse audiences and encouraging reflection on modern forms of exploitation, such as those in media and entertainment discussed in Section 6. Children's literature, too, has embraced Sarah's story, adapting it for younger audiences to foster empathy and awareness. Books like Sarah Baartman, The True Story by South African author Zukiswa Warner, simplify her narrative while emphasizing her humanity and the injustice she faced. These works, designed for educational settings, align with the pedagogical impact noted in Section 5, where Sarah's story is taught to inspire critical thinking about colonial history. By presenting her as a figure of strength, these stories counter the dehumanizing narratives of her lifetime, ensuring her legacy educates future generations. Performance and public memory. Performance art has played a crucial role in reclaiming Sarah Baartman's narrative, offering a dynamic medium to engage communities and challenge historical erasure. In South Africa, annual commemorations on Women's Day, as mentioned in Section 5, include performances that honor Sarah's memory. Traditional Khoikhoi dances and songs, suppressed during the colonial era described in Section 2, are performed at her gravesite in the Eastern Cape, celebrating her cultural heritage. These events transform the site into a living monument, contrasting the static, dehumanizing display of her remains in Paris, as detailed in Section 4. Globally, performance artists use Sarah's story to confront ongoing injustices. For example, South African artist Tracy Rose's installations, such as Venus Baartman, 2001, recreate Sarah's exhibitions in a way that critiques the colonial gaze, inviting audiences to question their role as spectators. These works echo the ethical storytelling advocated in Section 6, ensuring Sarah's story is told with respect rather than sensationalism. Similarly, international artists, including those from the African diaspora, incorporate her narrative into performances that address the hypersexualization of Black women, linking her experience to contemporary struggles outlined in Section 6. Public memory projects, such as memorials and exhibitions, further amplify Sarah's legacy. In Cape Town, the Sarah Baartman Center for Women and Children provides shelter and support for survivors of gender-based violence, directly connecting her story to modern feminist advocacy. This initiative reflects the intersectional struggles discussed in Section 6, addressing the compounded vulnerabilities of race and gender. Temporary exhibitions in museums, now informed by the ethical reforms spurred by her repatriation, Section 5, present her story with sensitivity, often in collaboration with Khoikhoi communities. These efforts ensure that her narrative is preserved as a lesson in justice rather than a spectacle, fulfilling the call in Section 1 to honor her dignity. Education and global inspiration. Sarah Baartman's story has become a cornerstone of educational curricula worldwide, as noted in Section 5, but its integration into art and performance enhances its pedagogical impact. In South Africa, schools use her story to teach about colonial history, racism, and gender justice, often through creative projects like student plays and poetry contests. These activities encourage students to engage with her story emotionally, fostering empathy and critical thinking about the systemic forces outlined in Sections 2 and 3. By integrating art into education, teachers ensure that Sarah's legacy is not reduced to historical facts, but serves as a catalyst for dialogue about modern inequities. Globally, her story inspires educational initiatives in countries with histories of colonialism. In the United States, for instance, African American studies programs use Sarah's narrative to explore the transatlantic slave trade and its cultural impacts, connecting to the stereotypes discussed in Section 4. In Australia, Aboriginal educators draw parallels between Sarah's exploitation and the treatment of Indigenous remains, reinforcing the repatriation movements inspired by her case, Section 5. These educational efforts align with the call in Section 6 for ethical storytelling, ensuring that her story is taught with respect and purpose. Sarah's influence extends to global human rights movements. Her story is cited in advocacy for Indigenous rights, particularly in campaigns to repatriate cultural artifacts and remains, as discussed in Section 5. Organizations like the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations reference her case when advocating for the protection of Indigenous heritage, linking her legacy to international frameworks for justice. Her story also informs discussions on reparations for colonial wrongs, challenging governments and institutions to address historical debts, a theme that resonates with the environmental justice concerns raised in Section 6. Conclusion. A call for justice and dignity. The journey of Sarah Baartman, traced through the preceding sections, is a profound testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. From the colonial dispossession of her Khoikhoi people in South Africa, Section 2, to the degrading exhibitions in London and Paris, Section 3, the posthumous desecration of her body as a scientific specimen, Section 4, and the triumphant repatriation of her remains in 2002, Section 5. Sarah's story, known as Sa in her native tongue, reveals the intersections of colonialism, racism, and sexism that stripped her of dignity. Section 6 highlighted her contemporary relevance, showing how her experience informs modern struggles against exploitation, while Section 7 illustrated how artists and activists have reclaimed her narrative, transforming her into a symbol of resistance. This concluding section synthesizes these threads, offering a powerful call to action to honor Sarah's legacy by confronting ongoing injustices, restoring dignity, and building a world where no one's humanity is commodified. Her story, as introduced in Section 1, is not just a historical tragedy, but a living challenge to create a future rooted in justice, empathy, and respect. Learning from the past, confronting historical wrongs. Sarah Baartman's life, as detailed in Sections 2 through IV, exposes the brutal machinery of colonialism that devastated her people and her personhood. The land seizures and cultural erasure inflicted on the Khoikhoi, Section 2. The voyeuristic spectacles that reduced her to the Hottentot Venus, Section 3. And the scientific racism that justified her posthumous display, Section 4. Were not isolated acts, but part of a systemic assault on Indigenous humanity. These injustices, driven by greed and prejudice, reflect what Section 1 described as the banality of evil, a society's willingness to normalize cruelty under the guise of progress, science, or entertainment. Learning from Sarah's story requires us to confront these historical wrongs head-on. The colonial ideologies that dehumanized her, as outlined in Section 2, laid the groundwork for centuries of racial and gender-based oppression, from slavery to apartheid to modern systemic inequities. Her exploitation was not an aberration but a symptom of a worldview that prioritized power and profit over human dignity. Today, this demands that we interrogate the legacies of colonialism in our institutions, from museums holding looted artifacts to media perpetuating harmful stereotypes. As Section 6 noted, Sarah's story informs campaigns against the objectification of Black women and the exploitation of marginalized communities, urging us to dismantle these systems rather than remain complicit. This reflection extends beyond history to our daily actions. Sarah's exhibitions, as described in Section 3, were attended by ordinary people who paid to gawk, revealing how societal indifference enables injustice. Today, we must ask, where do we participate in or ignore modern forms of exploitation, such as human trafficking, exploitative media, or the commodification of indigenous cultures? Sarah's story challenges us to reject passivity, to recognize the power of collective action, as seen in the Repatriation movement, Section 5, and to advocate for change in our communities. Her suffering is a warning that silence in the face of injustice perpetuates harm, a lesson as urgent now as it was in the 19th century. Honoring Sa, restoring her humanity. Central to Sarah Baartman's legacy is the act of restoring her identity as Sa, a Khoikhoi woman, rather than the Hottentot Venus imposed by her exploiters. Sections 1 and V emphasize the importance of calling her by her true name, a symbolic rejection of the colonial labels that erased her humanity. This act of renaming is more than linguistic. It is a reclamation of her agency, culture, and personhood, countering the dehumanization detailed in Sections 3 and V. By honoring Sa, we acknowledge her as a daughter, perhaps a sister or friend, with dreams and a heritage rooted in the Eastern Cape, a connection to the land severed by colonial violence. Section 2. This restoration is evident in the artistic works explored in Section 7, where poets, painters, and playwrights imagine her inner life, giving voice to her silenced emotions. These creations, from Diana Ferris's poem to Willie Bester's paintings, contrast sharply with the scientific reports that reduced her to a specimen. Section 4. They invite us to see Sa as a woman who resisted, even in small ways, as hinted at in Section 3's accounts of her defiance. Honoring her means continuing this work, telling her story with respect, ensuring it educates rather than exploits, as advocated in Section 6's discussion of ethical storytelling in the digital age. Her grave site in the Eastern Cape, a place of pilgrimage since her 2002 funeral, Section 5, is a physical embodiment of this restoration. Visitors leave flowers, poems, and stones, gestures that contrast with the cold, voyeuristic displays of her remains in Paris. These acts of care are a collective commitment to her dignity, echoing the call in Section 1 to build a world where no one's humanity is commodified. By honoring Sa, we affirm that her life was not defined by her suffering, but by her enduring impact as a symbol of resilience and justice. A vision for the future. Building a world of dignity. Sarah Baartman's story is a call to envision and create a future where dignity is inviolable, a theme woven through every section of this narrative. The colonial greed that uprooted her, Section 2. The exhibitions that exploited her body, Section 3. And the scientific desecration that followed her death, Section 4, were enabled by a worldview that dehumanized the other. Her repatriation, Section 5, and the artistic reclamation of her story, Section 7, show that resistance and restoration are possible, but they require sustained action. Section 6's exploration of her contemporary relevance addressing racial and gender stereotypes, ethical reforms, and environmental justice provides a blueprint for this action, outlining the challenges we must confront today. This vision begins with accountability. The institutions that profited from Sarah's exploitation, from museums to scientific bodies, must continue the reforms spurred by her case, as discussed in sections 5 and 6. Museums must repatriate looted remains and artifacts, collaborating with indigenous communities to ensure cultural respect. Scientists must adhere to ethical standards that prioritize consent and equity, learning from the failures of Georges Cuvier and his peers, Section 4. Media and entertainment industries must reject stereotypes that echo Sarah's objectification, promoting representations that celebrate diversity and humanity, as advocated in Section 6. The vision also demands collective responsibility. Individuals can support this future by amplifying ethical narratives, as seen in the digital activism of Section 6, and by supporting movements for indigenous rights, gender equality, and environmental justice. Sarah's story inspires coalitions across these struggles, from Black Lives Matter to indigenous land rights campaigns, showing that justice is interconnected. Her grave, a site of reflection and resistance, Section 5, reminds us that every act, whether a poem, a policy, or a protest, contributes to this vision. By learning from her story, we commit to a world where no one is reduced to a commodity, where every person's dignity is upheld. Synthesizing Sarah's legacy. Sarah Baartman's legacy is a tapestry woven from pain, resistance, and hope. Sections 2 through IV expose the colonial, scientific, and cultural forces that exploited her, revealing the systemic nature of her suffering. Section 5 celebrated the triumph of her repatriation, a testament to the power of collective action to restore dignity. Sections 6 and 7 showed how her story continues to inspire, through advocacy for modern justice and artistic reclamation of her humanity. Together, these sections fulfill the promise of Section 1, to see Sarah's story as both a tragedy and a call to action, a reminder that history's wounds can guide us toward healing. Her legacy challenges us to act with intention. Every time we call her Sa, we reject the colonial labels that defined her. Every time we teach her story, as in the educational efforts of Sections 5 and 7, we ensure it inspires change rather than voyeurism. Every time we advocate for justice, whether for indigenous rights, gender equality, or environmental protection, we honor her resilience. Her grave in the Eastern Cape, where visitors leave tokens of respect, is a living monument to this commitment, a place where the earth bears witness to her suffering and our responsibility to prevent its recurrence. A final call to action. Sarah Baartman's story is not a closed chapter, but an open invitation to build a better world. Her life as Sa, a Khoikhoi woman, was stolen by systems that prioritized power and profit over humanity, as detailed across this outline. Yet, her legacy, reclaimed through activism, Section 5, art, Section 7, and modern advocacy, Section 6, is a beacon for justice. It demands that we confront the echoes of her exploitation in our world, whether in media stereotypes, unethical science, or environmental harm, and take action to dismantle them. It calls us to support policies that protect marginalized communities, to amplify ethical narratives, and to honor the dignity of every person. As we stand at her gravesite, metaphorically or literally, we are reminded of the power of collective action. The repatriation of her remains, achieved through decades of struggle, shows that justice, though delayed, is possible. Her story, as introduced in Section 1, is a wound that refuses to heal until we act. By carrying forward her legacy, we pledge to create a world where no one's humanity is commodified, where Sa's name is spoken with reverence, and where justice and dignity are the foundation of our shared future. Let her story be our guide, a flame that lights the path toward a world free from exploitation, where every person is seen, valued, and whole.